Okay, welcome to the BJCP study group. This is Doug Piper. I'm your host, and I really appreciate your time here as we grow our beer skills together. I'm a certified Cicerone and a BJCP judge, and I'm working on advanced ranks like many of you there in the audience are. And the beer study groups are the way that I am kind of sharing what I'm learning on my beer journey, and I hope that it helps you on your beer journey. Today, we've got John Pallmer, and John has graced us with several webinars so far. And John, we really appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
And I'm getting a little feedback here from something. Okay, see if that goes away.
Okay.
Yes, that's perfect. Cool. So today, John's going to help us go through the diastatic and proteolytic enzymes question. But first of all, there's just a couple of things that I want to go through. First of all, the single most important thing is neither John nor I speak for the BJCP organization. John knows a lot. I don't know anywhere near what John knows, but neither of us speak for the organization. So please take all this as just educational aspects that we're just trying to help each other. I would also say that if you can't hear, and people I know have those issues, double check your mute and your volume control. You wouldn't be, let me try that again. You would not be surprised how often that happens. And I would also, if our screen freezes, chances are it could be an app problem. And if you just refresh your screen, almost 70-80% of the time, that'll correct the problem. This is a series of webinars that I'm doing to help us all in our BJCP and Cicerone journeys to learn about various beers. And in particular, this one is to focus on passing the BJCP written exam. So I do want to remind everybody it is a totally viewer-supported initiative. I would ask you that if there's any way you can support us on this journey, please consider doing that. So now that we're through all of that, let me introduce John. John is the editor-in-chief and the publications director at the Master Brewers Association of America. He spent over 20 years in aerospace and medical devices. He is the author of the largest, or maybe one of the largest, brewing books, How to Brew, also Brewing Classic Styles, and the Water Book. And John, I heard earlier in the week you had kind of a celestial experience when you were out barbecuing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, I would say it was more climatological than celestial, but yeah, I was out grilling some dinner the other night, and it actually snowed on me here in Los Angeles. It's been raining, off and on for the last couple of weeks. And it's been cold the last few days, and this big cloud just kind of came over the mountain and started snowing on me. So, the sun was shining, and the air temperature was around 40 degrees where I was, or at least that's what the thermometer was saying. It was snowing. It didn't last long, but it definitely snowed.
So, what were you barbecuing?
Some skirt steaks, I believe. Yeah. Ooh. Some carne asada type steaks. Yeah.
Well, that sounds mighty good. Well, let's jump into the webinar, John. The primary question we're trying to answer today, as you well know, is discussing the role of proteolytic and diastatic enzymes.
Yep.
And we need to focus in on, as far as the BJCP question is concerned, 40% of this is the role in the brewing process. The other 40% is its impact on the characteristics of the finished beer. And last but not least, 20% is defining the enzyme. So how would you guide us as we are preparing for this test to help us really understand those enzymes?
Well, I'll pull up my presentation here in a second, but yeah, basically you have two classes of the enzymes. You have the proteolytic enzymes, which are the protein acting enzymes, and you have the diastatic enzymes, which are the ones that convert the starches to sugars. So, but I find both the enzyme question and the mashing question really tie together. And in fact, you really can't talk about one without talking about the other. And you can't talk about either without talking about malting first. So I know that y'all just listened to John Mallett on Talk About Malt a couple of weeks ago. But I thought it'd be a good refresher to go through the malting process so you understand what's happening during malting and what the role of these enzymes during malting and mashing are. So let's get into the slides.
Well, John, I just realized in my haste to get into this, I skipped the most important part.
the calibration, eh?
Yeah.
All
I
right.
apologize for that.
No worries.
I apologize. Can we still start with that?
Yep. I've got my Bell's Porter here and my tasting glass.
There we go. Well, I'm going to open mine and fire away.
Okay. Refresh mine here. This is a American porter. A lot of people have trouble differentiating between porter and stout, and for good reason. They're very similar styles. Once upon a time, the only difference was just the name. They were fundamentally the same style of beer. These days, they're a little bit different. Porter is characterized by more, or I should say, less roast character than a stout. Definitions change, but to my mind, the difference between porter and stout is that stout has roast barley character. Porter should not. Porter has the color and has some sweet and caramel and chocolate malt notes. It does have a roast character, but that should come from like a black malt as opposed to, say, a roast barley, which is a very subtle difference, I agree. But the predominant character should not be roast. It should be more of a mixture of dark crystal, chocolate, burnt marshmallow, just a hints of roast, hints of coffee. Now, this particular porter has a very nice aroma. A little bit spicy. I would almost say that it smells like root beer. There is a slight sweetness. There's a slight spiciness to the aroma, which I don't think comes from hops. Yeah, just it's a very enticing aroma. A lighter body than a stout. Clears the palate quickly. There's definitely malt sweetness in the flavor. No lingering roast on the tongue. Slight hop flavor. Again, I would characterize that more of a spicy character, which may come from the yeast as opposed to the hops. I'm not real sure, but yeah, good medium body, clean finish, a little bit sweet, lingering bitterness in the back of the mouth, but overall a very nicely balanced beer. Very drinkable, very drinkable. There's nothing heavy about this beer that would prevent you from putting away, 4 or 5 pints, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think Randy Mosher described it as kind of a mocha coffee was his definition of a porter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that fits it quite nicely. It's actually my first one, so I'm glad you talked me into it.
Yeah.
Sorry there, John Mallett.
Well, I had the pleasure of going out to Bell's a couple years ago in the fall, and I don't get back to my home state often enough, but certainly Bell's Brewery puts out just a wide range of great beers. They have a Midwestern Pale Ale, or at least they used to, that I would swear was my own homebrewed pale ale. It was nearly identical. So yeah, really enjoy their beers.
Well, that's quite a compliment. John does do some great beers, and I appreciate you doing the commercial calibration, because I know it helps all of us to kind of hear how other people interpret the aromas, but more importantly, how you descriptively express them. And I know I've got a test coming up, so I always appreciate hearing these too. So it's a little embarrassing that I almost let it slip by.
No worries. Well, let's dive into the presentation.
That sounds perfect.
Oh, sure. There we go. So let's go to the question. Define the diastatic and proteolytic enzymes, discuss their roles in the brewing process and how they affect the characteristics of the final beer. Define each enzyme, discuss their roles, how they affect the beer. And like I said, we really can't talk about enzymes without talking about mashing. But first, let's cover the first question, define each enzyme. So your proteolytic enzymes work on the proteins. They work to break down the endosperm of the barley and release the starch granules. The starch granules are what the diastatic enzymes work on. Now we have two classes of proteolytic enzymes. We have the proteases and the peptidases. Proteases mainly make the large insoluble storage proteins into smaller soluble proteins, okay? Large insoluble to smaller soluble. From there, those proteases, and there's like 40 different proteases and peptidases. I mean, we're talking about, a class of enzymes, not just one. It's a whole group. It's like talking about cats. We're talking about many, many, many types of cats with the proteases and peptidases. Okay. So your peptidases then take these smaller soluble proteins and start cutting the tips off to make amino acids. Okay. The peptidases can't do their work if the proteases don't break the large proteins and soluble proteins down into smaller soluble proteins first. Okay. So 50% of the total protein now, in barley, about we're saying there's an average of about 9% protein by weight in the barley kernel. So 50% of that 9% will be solubilized during malting by these enzymes. Only 20% more of that protein will be solubilized during mashing. And then about 3% of that total 70% soluble protein will become free amino nitrogen. Okay, so that's how this protein breakdown works along those lines. Next, we come to our diastatic enzymes, and of course, these are the ones everybody talks about. Your diastatic enzymes convert the starches to sugars, and you have your alpha amylase, which cuts the starch chains randomly at any point along the chain, except next to the branch points. Then you have your beta amylase, which creates maltose, and it nips these maltose molecules from the ends of the starch chains. Finally, there's limit dextrinase, which is a very, very important enzyme, and it cuts the branch points. So in the starch world, you have very large starch molecules, many branches, many chains, and alpha can go in and start breaking those very complex chains up into simpler chains. Beta can come along and start nipping maltose off, but when it comes to a branch point, it has to stop. Limit dextrinase can break up those branch points and release more straight chain starch molecules that beta and alpha are freer to work on. So all three of these enzymes, these diastatic enzymes, work together to break down and convert the starches to sugars. So, no malt, no mash, but if you know malt, then you know mashing. So malting, enzymes, and mashing are all interrelated. And I want to take a step back now and let's talk about malting. Help you put this in context. So what is malt? Well, barley is a seed. It is a cereal grain. And malting is a process of partial growth. You soak the barley in water to germinate it. You let it grow a little bit. Then you dry it to stop that growth. And then we kiln it, toasting or roasting, to develop more flavor into that malt. And then this dried malt is delivered to the brewer. So malting is a partial germination and growth process. Gotta get over here to, oops. Okay. So why do we malt barley in the first place? Well, it's important to understand that raw barley seeds are as hard as little rocks. You can't really eat them. It's just like trying to eat dried beans. You'd break your teeth on them. So when you soak them and you hydrate them and cook, and then warm them up, then they start this germination process that results in an overall softening of the kernel, and which allows the enzymes to act on it and makes it much easier to eat. But of course, why would you want to eat it when you can actually brew with it? Here's a diagram of a malting house. So the first step is that the barley is steeped under controlled conditions to allow it to absorb about 45% by weight of water. And that initiates the germination process. Now for germination, the malt is moved over from the steeping tank to a germination bed, which you see down here. Here's a diagram. The barley is now internally releasing enzymes. It's starting to modify to break down that endosperm and release those starches. And rootlets will grow. The acrospire, the little embryo in the barley, will start growing. And but in doing so, it starts generating heat. And so you've got to keep the barley turned, keep it aerated and turned, and keep it at a cool temperature to prevent it from overheating and potentially molding or growing too fast and growing into a little plant. We don't want little plants. We want barley malt that we can turn into beer. Let's compare unmalted barley versus malted. The unmalted is a very hard, glassy protein carbohydrate matrix that we call the endosperm. The cell walls within that matrix are intact, and those cell walls are made up of various polysaccharides, including beta-glucan. The proteins in that matrix are very large, and they are not water soluble. Only about 30% of the protein at that point is soluble. So during malting, what we do is we start breaking that matrix down, and we render those, we render those cell walls, break them down. We'd reduce that beta glucan into, other non-glucan particles. And after malting, about 70% of the protein is rendered soluble. So the barley kernel, the endosperm, contains these starch granules in the protein carbohydrate matrix. The purpose of malting is to unlock this matrix and make those starches accessible to the enzymes. Germination releases the proteolytic enzymes and beta-glucanase with that enzyme and alpha amylase, which all work together to start breaking down this matrix. The amount of breakdown is called modification. So after the malt is fully modified, then that malt is dried for storage for delivery to the brewer. And here's a picture of, where is that? Here we go. Here's a picture of fresh malt straight out of the germination tank. You can see the little rootlets there. You should never see an acrospire that is a plant shoot growing out of the end of the barley. Seeing these little rootlets is perfectly acceptable. That's common, but you should never see a plant shoot. That means that the malting has gone beyond malting and turned into a plant.
Does that create an off flavor?
No, it just means that there's no starch left to convert to sugar for the brewer.
Oh.
So, yeah, we want that sugar, not the plant. We don't want the plant to have it. So, kind of selfish, but oh well. After germination, and then the malt is dried, and the total drying and curing time is typically between 18 to 24 hours. And that is simply kind of that curing process. Let's see. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We want to reduce the moisture content to about 4%. So we'll start out drying it at a very low temperature, like 50 degrees C, which is like 120 Fahrenheit. And then finishes about 85 degrees C, which is like 185 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. And then once we're down to around, I think it's 5 to 6% moisture, then they talk about curing to get to that final 4%, and that can be done at higher temperatures, anywhere from 75 to 105 degrees Celsius, right? And basically up to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is at this stage is when you're differentiating the kind of malt you're making. If it's a Pilsner malt, it's going to be a low temperature cure. If it's a pale ale malt, it'll be a little higher temperature cure. If you go on to make a Vienna, that's even higher temperature, and you entered into the kilning range, then higher than 105 degrees. Same with Munich malt, again, a little higher temperature yet. I'm getting a little bit off on a tangent there, but so we're talking about malting. We're talking about the breakdown of the endosperm to release these starches and make them available for the brewer. It's important to understand that mashing and malting are two parts of the same overall process of making these sugars available to the brewer. The more you malt, the more you modify it, the less you have to mash. And if you malt too much, you now have a little barley sprout that you can use in your salad. So modification describes the degree of malting, in other words, the degree that the endosperm has been broken down. One aspect of modification that's used to gauge it is the protein degradation. And we talk about the percentage of proteins that are now small enough to be water soluble. And so on malt analysis sheets, you'll see this described as the soluble to total nitrogen ratio. the ST ratio, or the Kolbach index. All the same names, or different names for the same thing. Soluble to total nitrogen or cobalt index. And that's a
John,
percentage. Yes?
While you're switching slides, I did want to remind everybody, we do have questions, and the Ask a Question field is at the bottom. I see we have about 8 questions. Because we have another webinar right after this, we could be kind of tight on our timing. So I would encourage you that if you see a question you would like to have answered, vote that. Everybody has one vote. So push it up to the top, and that will help.
Okay.
Thanks, John. We'll keep going.
All right. So we'll talk a little about the soluble to total nitrogen ratio. It is, like I said, it indicates the degree of unlocking. And to generalize, 30 to 36% is a less modified malt that is suitable for decoction. 36 to 42% is a well-modified malt that is more suitable for single or multiple infusion mashing. 42 to 48% is highly modified, and it is eminently suitable for just a single rest infusion mash. Now, opinions on where these boundaries are vary. This is my opinion and those of a few other people, kind of generally accepted. When we're talking about a less modified malt, that is one that would benefit from a protein rest during mashing to finish that protein breakdown, render more of that total protein soluble, to break down that matrix a little bit further, to release those starches better. And we'll talk a little bit more about decoction, of course, when we get to the mashing section today. So here's a diagram that kind of describes pictorially what's going on. If you imagine this box and sphere as being the barley kernel, the cube on the outside is the husk. Inside the endosperm, you have the endosperm that is the sphere, and it's a very ordered and rigid matrix that's composed of both large starch granules and small starch granules. The small starch granules outnumber the large, so they make up about 70% of the total starch in the endosperm. And they often have a higher gelatinization temperature than the large starch granules, if I remember right. All of this is in How to Brew, so and I never memorize it too well. I just look it up in there. Okay, so after malting, the husk is still intact, but now the endosperm has been broken down. And so you can see how I've changed the solid sphere to a dotted sphere. And you can see how the starch granules are a little more random with the, both large and small. And we have this nice unlocking icon here to help drive that point home. So that, the purpose of malting is to unlock the endosperm, break down those cell walls, and make those starch granules more available to the brewer. We aren't converting them yet. That will be done during mashing, but we're just making them available. Let's see, here's our final slide for this section, some electron microscope, and you can actually see the cross section of the barley kernel and the endosperm, and then a close-up of that endosperm. And so you can see the matrix, you can see these granules embedded in the matrix. Here's some of the smalls, there's some of the bigs. It's quite a little structure. So the next slide is the mashing slide. But before we go on to that, I thought maybe we'd address some of those questions. So, Doug, do we have those?
We certainly do. And we've got one very popular one we're going to start with.
Okay.
Looks like Tom Bradley has submitted that. And the question is a protein rest necessary to activate protein enzymes in fully modified malts, or is it more appropriate for grist with larger amounts of unmalted adjuncts? Could a protein rest with modified malts impact the beer flavor?
Yep. And this is a perfect example of a question that we will talk about during the mashing section of the today. So yeah, I'll get to that. The short answer though is that the highly modified malt has already been through a protein rest during malting. So all of this protein breakdown happened during the malting phase. Doing more of it during mashing is not necessary. You would essentially take the favorable composition of various protein sizes and break them down further. And you would probably lose head retention and increase haze, generate more amino acids than you need, which would overfeed the yeast, probably leading to more diacetyl and more Strecker aldehydes and off flavors in the beer. So yes, you can mash too much. You can protein rest too much. That can have flavor effects. Now I will talk about this more in the next segment.
All right, we'll move to our next one. This is from Brett Palomaki. I probably brutalized that one too. Does roasted malt affect the amount of soluble proteins? Would a roasted malt have more or less proteins than a standard malted barley?
It will have less. Roasted malts have been through a high degree of kilning and roasting. Most of the proteins have been pyrolyzed, reacted with sugars, that are present in the barley. They've been through Maillard reactions, which reacts amino acids with sugars. So, yeah, a lot of those soluble proteins have been and sugars have been reacted with each other, and so they're really not available to what they were before in their different form. So yeah, roasted